Every night, fear ruled her world, until the rancher placed her trembling hands over his heartbeat and changed everything. What began as protection became healing, and what began as survival became something stronger than either of them expected. This is the story of a woman learning to live again, and the man who refused to let her face the darkness alone, watching from. Let's get started. The nights had grown colder on the frontier, but the rancher barely felt the chill anymore. What kept him awake wasn't the wind or the coyotes howling across the open plains. It was the sound of her fear. The young woman he had rescued months ago still lived in the small cabin behind his house, still waking with a scream trapped in her throat. The nightmares didn't fade the way he hoped they would. Instead, they clung to her like shadows she couldn't escape. He sat outside her door each night, coat wrapped around him, determined to be close enough to hear her if she needed him. The first scream usually came just after midnight, sharp and panicked, echoing through the silence. He pushed open her door gently, never wanting to startle her more than she already was. The lantern on the small table flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows across the wooden walls. She sat upright in bed, shaking, her breathing ragged, as if she had run for miles in her sleep. He spoke softly to her, reminding her that the danger was gone, that she was safe here, far from the men who had hurt her. Sometimes she believed him, sometimes she didn't, but she always calmed when he held her trembling hands. He wished he could chase away the memories that haunted her, wished he could pull the pain out of her dreams and bury it deep enough that it would never touch her again. But healing wasn't a quick ride across open land. It was slow, uneven, and often painful. She apologized every time he came into the room, but he always shook his head, telling her she owed him nothing. Her pain wasn't a burden. Her survival was what mattered. He just wanted her to rest, to feel even a moment of peace that stayed with her until morning. The second scream usually arrived an hour later. He would be sitting against the wall, eyes half closed, when her voice pierced the quiet once more. He rushed in before she could even catch her breath. This time she clung to him, tears streaking her face as she shook violently. The attack she'd endured had left scars deeper than anything he could see. She told him once that the dark made her feel trapped again, that closing her eyes made the memories come alive, sharp and merciless. He held her gently, whispering steady words, anchoring her to the present until she could finally let go. Sometimes she didn't speak at all after a nightmare. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, eyes unfocused, lost somewhere between the past and the present. He lit another lantern to make the room brighter, warmed a blanket by the stove, and draped it over her shoulders. He stayed close enough that she knew she wasn't alone, but far enough that she didn't feel crowded. She once told him she didn't understand why he cared so much. He answered with honesty, "Because you deserve someone who does." The words made her eyes soften, though she said nothing in return. By the time the third scream tore through the silence, the rancher felt exhaustion tugging at the corners of his mind. He hadn't slept more than a few hours a night since she came to live there, but he refused to leave her alone. Tonight, her voice cracked with desperation as she called out, and he moved faster than before. She was tangled in her blanket, fighting invisible hands from her memories, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders, grounding her back to reality. Her eyes opened wide, darting around the room until they found his. Relief washed over her face as she whispered his name, like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. He helped her drink water, her hands shaking too much to hold the cup steady. She apologized again for waking him, but he brushed it aside. He didn't tell her how tired he was, didn't mention the ache in his bones or how his eyes burned from lack of sleep. She wasn't a problem. She was someone who needed him, and he would never turn away. He knew what isolation did to a wounded soul. He had lived with his own ghosts once, though he rarely spoke of them. Maybe that was why he understood her pain so well. The fourth scream came closer to dawn. She didn't scream loudly this time, just a sharp gasp followed by a trembling whimper. He opened her door slowly, not wanting to frighten her. She was curled on her side, shivering even under the thick blankets. This time, instead of reaching for him, she pulled away slightly, embarrassed by how helpless she felt. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb her too much. He spoke softly, telling her that healing wasn't weakness, that fear didn't make her fragile. She had survived something terrible and was still fighting every night. That to him was strength. She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw the exhaustion etched into his face. The lines beneath his eyes were deeper, the stubble darker, the weight of many sleepless nights visible. Guilt flickered across her face, tears filling her eyes again. He shook his head gently, refusing to let her blame herself. He told her he stayed because he wanted to, not because he felt obligated. She whispered a quiet "thank you," her voice cracking under the weight of all the things she couldn't express. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, the gesture gentle and reassuring. The fifth scream came just before sunrise, softer than the others, almost like a wounded plea. When he entered her room, she was sitting upright, gasping for breath, gripping the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. He sat beside her again, letting her steady herself. Before speaking, her breathing eventually slowed, though her eyes remained haunted. He placed her hand over his chest, letting her feel the steady beat of his heart, grounding her. She closed her eyes, focusing on that rhythm, until the shaking began to fade. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to pull her back. When the first light of morning filtered into the cabin, she finally relaxed enough to lean into him. It was the first time she had allowed herself that closeness. He wrapped his arm gently around her, holding her without pressure, giving her a sense of safety she hadn't felt since before her life had shattered. She rested her head against his shoulder, eyes heavy but calmer than before. The nightmares had drained her, but she wasn't alone in the aftermath. She knew that now. She could feel it in the way he stayed. Tired, yes, but unwavering. The rancher watched the sunrise through the small window, feeling her breathing slow as she drifted into a more peaceful sleep. It was the first moment of stillness they had shared in weeks. He didn't dare move, afraid he might disturb the fragile calm she had fought so hard to reach. As the light warmed the wooden walls, he realized he would stay through 1,000 nights like this if it meant she would eventually heal. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing with certainty. She would never face the darkness alone again. The rancher had grown used to exhaustion, but lately the weight of it pressed down harder than before. Every time he caught himself nodding off, he forced his eyes open, reminding himself that she needed him more than he needed rest. Still, his body betrayed him, his shoulders sagging, steps slower, hands trembling slightly when he reached for the lantern. She noticed everything, every yawn he tried to hide, every weary breath. She hated that he was draining himself for her nightmares, hated that she couldn't stop them. Hated most of all the fear that she was becoming a burden. He always reassured her with a tired smile, insisting he was fine, that he'd slept through worse during cattle drives. But she saw the truth in the shadows beneath his eyes, in the stiffness of his movements. He didn't complain, not once, but silence held its own kind of confession. She felt guilt coil inside her like a tightening rope, wishing she could give him peace the way he tried to give it to her. Yet every night the darkness returned hungry, and she knew he'd come running the moment she cried out. That night the storm outside made everything worse. Thunder rattled the windows, lightning split the sky, and the wind howled like the ghosts of her past. Rain battered the cabin roof, each strike echoing through her bones. She tried to steady her thoughts, to breathe slowly the way he taught her. But as the storm grew fiercer, memories flooded back, the ropes, the men, the helpless terror. Her breath caught, her vision blurred, and suddenly she was no longer in the cabin. She was back in the nightmare she fought so hard to escape. When she woke, the scream tore from her throat before she even opened her eyes. Her whole body shook violently, like the fear was trying to break free of her skin. She gasped for air, choking on panic, unable to form words. The rancher burst into the room instantly, but when he saw her trembling that violently, he froze for the first time. He hesitated, not from fear of her, but fear of hurting her more. She looked wild with panic, lost somewhere between nightmare and reality, and he didn't know if touching her would anchor her or shatter her. He stepped slowly toward the bed, hands open, movements gentle as a whisper. The lantern flickered, painting trembling shadows across her pale face. She stared at him with wide, terrified eyes that didn't seem to recognize him. That broke something inside him. He knelt beside her, voice quiet, soothing, trying to guide her back with the steadiness she'd relied on for months. But her hands clawed at the blanket, her breath sharp and rapid, as if she was drowning in her own fear. He reached forward, then stopped just inches from her, afraid she would push him away. The truth was, he didn't want to scare her by touching her without permission. He knew trauma was unpredictable, knew that sometimes the gentlest gesture could trigger the deepest panic. He waited, heart pounding, wishing she would speak, wishing she could tell him what she needed. The storm outside roared louder, the thunder shaking the walls like the world itself was trembling with her. She gasped again, her body jerking with a violent tremor, and he realized she was spiraling deeper into the nightmare. If he didn't act now, she would slip too far into fear to hear him at all. He made a choice, not out of instinct, but out of devotion. He reached out carefully, placing his hand lightly over hers. She flinched, but didn't pull away. That small mercy gave him courage. He spoke her name softly, repeating it like an anchor. Slowly, her frantic gaze shifted toward him, confused but searching. He held her hand firmly enough to ground her, gently enough to comfort. Her trembling lessened, though her breathing remained ragged. He leaned closer, his voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing him down, reminding her that she was here, with him, safe from everything that haunted her. Tears slid down her cheeks, not from the nightmare, but from the sight of him. His hair was wet from the storm, shoulders soaked through where the rain had hit him as he sprinted from the barn after a sudden noise. His face was pale with worry, his breath uneven, his hands still shaking slightly, not just from exhaustion, but from the fear of failing her. The guilt inside her sharpened painfully. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice cracked into silence. She couldn't say the apology she wanted to, couldn't form the words that weighed on her heart. He reached for the blanket, pulling it gently around her as another clap of thunder shook the cabin. She flinched again, her body curling inward like she expected the world to hit her. He hated seeing her shrink like that, hated that her past still had the power to break her spirit. He wished he could take every memory from her, shoulder the pain himself if it meant she could rest. He moved to sit on the edge of the bed, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not trapped. His presence filled the room quietly, steady as a heartbeat. She closed her eyes, trying to breathe through the shaking. His hand remained wrapped around hers, grounding her to the present. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, she felt a shift. Small, fragile, but real. She trusted him, even in her terror. She knew he wouldn't hurt her, wouldn't rush her, wouldn't leave her alone in the dark. Slowly, she leaned toward him, her forehead brushing his shoulder. The contact surprised them both. She tensed at first, but he stayed perfectly still, letting her choose how close she wanted to be. When she didn't pull away, he exhaled softly, relief warming his tired eyes. Her breathing steadied against him, the trembling slowly fading. The storm outside began to soften, the thunder growing distant, the rain quieter against the roof. He wrapped one arm lightly around her shoulders, careful not to startle her. She pressed closer, needing the comfort more than she had ever allowed herself to admit. His heart beat steadily beneath her cheek, strong and unwavering. For the first time that night, she felt the nightmare loosen its grip, slipping away into the shadows. She whispered his name, barely audible but full of gratitude he didn't know how to respond to. He rested his chin gently atop her head, the exhaustion settling deeper into his bones, but he didn't dare move. She had let him in, trusted him in her most vulnerable moment. That trust meant more to him than anything. He whispered reassurances, soft and warm, until her breath finally slowed into something close to calmness. She didn't fall asleep immediately. Fear still lingered at the edges of her thoughts, but she stayed close, drawing strength from his presence. He hoped she couldn't feel how tired he was, how desperately he wanted sleep he wouldn't take until she did. Minutes stretched into an hour, and the storm fully passed. The cabin grew quiet, the only sound their breathing in the dim lantern light. She finally lifted her head, her eyes softer now, though rimmed with tears. She touched his hand hesitantly, as if afraid he might pull away. He didn't. Her voice came out cracked but clear. A soft apology, mixed with gratitude. He shook his head immediately, brushing his thumb across the back of her hand, telling her she never needed to apologize for surviving. She swallowed hard, tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the kindness she didn't feel she deserved. He helped her lie back down, adjusting the blankets around her with. She didn't let go of his hand until the last moment, and even then, her fingers lingered against his. He sat beside the bed, watching her breathing grow steadier, waiting for any sign of another nightmare, exhaustion finally claiming her. When her eyes finally closed in peaceful sleep, a rare thing, he allowed himself to relax slightly. He rested his arms on his knees, tired beyond words, but unwilling to leave her side. The rancher didn't know what the next night would bring. He didn't know if the nightmares would return stronger or fade slowly. He didn't know how long it would take for her to heal, but he knew one thing without question. He would stay through every storm, every scream, every long night, until she no longer trembled, until her past no longer haunted her sleep, until peace returned to her life, and maybe to his as well. The rancher didn't move at first. He sat there, steady as the wooden chest at the foot of her bed, listening to her frantic breath soften one by one. The moment he placed her trembling hands over his heartbeat, something shifted between them. Quiet, unspoken, but unmistakably real. She clung to that rhythm as if it were a rope pulling her out of a dark pit. The fear in her eyes loosened, giving way to a fragile kind of trust he hadn't seen from her since the night she arrived on his land, bruised, exhausted, and barely alive. When she finally relaxed, her fingers still rested lightly against his chest, feeling the solid beat that anchored her. Her old nightdress, torn and threadbare from months of restless sleep, clung to her shoulders. She hesitated, embarrassed, but he pretended not to notice. Instead, he pulled a soft wool blanket around her with slow, careful movements. She watched him with a new softness, something warm rising behind her tired gaze, and for the first time in so long, she allowed herself to lean into him without flinching. He knew the nightmares weren't just dreams, they were echoes of what she had survived. He also knew that healing wasn't simple, and it wasn't something he could force. So he stayed quiet, giving her space to say something if she needed to, but she didn't speak. She simply breathed, her cheek resting lightly against his shoulder. The cabin was silent, except for the gentle crackling of the fire and the faint rustle of cotton as she shifted. Outside, the wind howled, but inside she felt wrapped in safety. As she drifted towards sleep, her fingers twitched against his shirt, as if afraid he might disappear. He didn't pull away. Instead, he adjusted her blankets, making sure she stayed warm. When he noticed how worn her dress was, he quietly rose, walked to the wooden chest across the room, and pulled out a simple, clean cotton dress, soft, modest, and new. He placed it beside her pillow, not saying a word, giving her the choice to take it whenever she felt ready. She woke some minutes later, eyes fluttering open. Noticed the dress folded beside her. Something in her expression softened. There was no pity in his gesture, no pressure, just care. She touched the fabric gently, running her fingers then she over looked the smooth cotton, her voice as barely above a whisper, precious, thanking him in a way that carried more emotion than any long speech could have. It was the first time she'd spoken so calmly after a nightmare. The next morning, she slipped into the new dress, tying the ribbon at the waist with trembling hands. It fit her loosely but comfortably, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel trapped inside her own clothing. When she stepped out of the bedroom, the rancher froze mid-stride. He didn't stare, didn't make her uncomfortable. He simply smiled, slow and warm, as if seeing her truly alive for the first time. She blushed and looked away, but he could tell she felt different, lighter, steadier, almost herself again. As they sat at the small wooden table for breakfast, the morning sunlight fell across her new dress, making it glow softly. She traced the rim of her cup with delicate fingers, trying to find words for something she didn't yet understand. The rancher didn't rush her. He brewed her tea, served her eggs, and spoke gently about the horses and the quiet chores waiting outside. She listened, comforted by the ordinariness of it all. For months, her life had been defined by fear, but now she found reassurance in the simple rhythm of his voice. Later that day, he took her outside. The sky was blue and wide, stretching endlessly across the plains. She breathed in the crisp air, letting it fill her lungs until the heaviness inside her eased a little more. He showed her how to brush the horses, how to walk with them slowly, letting their calm presence settle her. Every moment felt like a small step forward, a quiet reclaiming of herself. The nightmares still lingered, buried deep, but the daylight made them feel less powerful, less capable of swallowing her whole. As evening approached, she sat on the porch wrapped in a shawl, watching the sunset paint the land in gold and rose. The rancher sat beside her, close but not too close. She felt safe near him in a way she couldn't explain. When she turned to him and thanked him, really thanked him, for staying through every nightmare, his eyes softened with a warmth she hadn't seen before. He told her softly that she didn't owe him anything, but she disagreed in her heart. She knew she owed him her life. That night, when the nightmares stirred, she didn't scream. She woke with a start, heart racing, but instead of collapsing into panic, she pressed her hand against her chest, remembering the steady beat she had felt under his palm. She breathed slowly in and out, grounding herself. And then, for the first time, she walked to the door on her own. When she opened it, the rancher was already there, half awake. She wrapped her shawl tighter, and he handed her a warm cup of tea. She told him small things, simple memories, pieces of who she used to be, fragments of hope she thought she had lost forever. He listened without interrupting, offering nothing but presence and understanding. She spoke of fear, but also of what she wanted for her future. By the end of her quiet confession, he realized something surprising. Helping her had healed him too. Weeks passed. Her nightmares didn't disappear completely, but they no longer controlled her. She walked with confidence, spoke with more strength, and each day regained another piece of the life taken from her. The dress he'd given her became a symbol to her, not of charity, but of renewal. She added small touches to the cabin, cooked meals with him, and took care of the animals as though she belonged there. And slowly, steadily, she began to smile again. Her laughter returned like a fragile bird learning to fly. One evening, as they stood outside under the stars, she finally said the words he'd been afraid to hope for. She said she wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. The rancher looked at her, searching her eyes for hesitation, but found none. She wanted to stay because she felt safe, because this place felt like healing, and because his presence steadied her in a way nothing else ever had. His breath caught for a moment, but then he nodded softly, welcoming her choice. That night, she slept peacefully again. No screams, no trembling, only quiet breathing and warm moonlight drifting across her new dress hanging by the window. The rancher sat nearby, watching over her not out of duty, but out of something deeper, something he finally allowed himself to acknowledge. She had brought life back into his world, just as he had brought safety into hers. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between fear and healing, something tender began to grow between them, something built on trust, on shared scars, on gentle beginnings. By dawn, both of them understood the truth. They had saved each other.